Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
It's time to turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
Good evening, listener. You're listening to Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. On tonight's episode, we invite you to leave behind your safe reality and descend with us into the frightening depths of the most terrifying imaginations. With 2 audio adaptations of chilling fiction about ancient curses, horrifying creatures, and the terrifying unknown. I'm your host, Geoff Sturtevant, and tonight, I'll be your guide as we traverse the dimly lit corridors of your darkest dreams. We're also thrilled to welcome a special guest narrator for tonight's episode, someone whose voice and passion for horror have captivated audiences around the globe. Joining us is none other than Skott Pye, the creator of the NaturesTemper YouTube channel. Skott is a zoologist, naturalist, and narrator of scary stories, with a knack for blending his love of the natural world with the eerie and unsettling. Skott, welcome to the show. Why don't you tell our audience a little about yourself?
Thanks, Geoff. It's a pleasure to be here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the guy behind the NaturesTemper YouTube channel, where I narrate short stories with a variety of voices and accents to bring the characters to life. My narrations cover everything from man-made slashers to otherworldly, existence-ending monstrosities, with the goal of keeping listeners at the edge of their seats. When I'm not narrating horror, I'm a zoologist and naturalist. I'm slightly obsessed with the natural world, and occasionally share animal-related videos as well. I'm also a hobbyist weightlifter. My current heaviest lift is 500 kilos. That's around 1,102 pounds on the leg press. And with any luck, I'll lift my listeners' spirits up too.
Well, as long as you don't kick them. Anyway, Skott, speaking of your channel, I know you've got something special lined up for your audience soon. Do you want to share a bit about your upcoming narration of Chilling Tales creator Craig Groshek's The Erasure?
Absolutely, Geoff. I'm really excited about this one. The Erasure is an incredibly atmospheric and haunting story. It follows a man named Simon, who on Halloween night finds himself drawn into an inexplicable series of events that begins with an eerie walk through his local park and spirals into something far more sinister.
I've read it, and I have to say, this one will keep listeners on the edge of their seats. It's a slow descent into dread, full of mysterious disappearances and unsettling revelations. And that ending? Well, I won't spoil it.
Let's just say it's a story that stays with you long after you've heard it. Can't wait for my audience to experience it.
Listeners, if you enjoy Skott's performances tonight, you'll definitely want to check out his narration of The Erasure on his NaturesTemper YouTube channel, coming out Thursday, December 12th, 2024. And when you do, be sure to mention that Geoff and the team of Chilling Tales for Dark Nights sent you.
That's right. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the story. So stop by, leave a comment, and let me know you're coming from Chilling Tales. We're all in this together.
We sure are. But for now, let's dive into our first tale of the evening. Our first tale, written by M. Lycantrope, is a haunting account of one man's lifelong battle with a malevolent entity, one born of mist and fear. A story of survival, obsession, and the thin line between man and monster. Now, without further ado, here's NaturesTemper, Skott Pye, with Man Made from Mist.
Every single day, the same dreams. I'm forced to relive the same memories whenever I close my eyes. Over 40 years have passed since then, but my subconscious is still trapped in one of those nights. As sad as it sounds, life moved on and so did I. As much as I could call it moving on, after all. My life's mission was to do away with the source of my problems, to do away with the man made from mist. Or so I thought. I've clamored for a chance to take my vengeance on him for so long. The things I've done to get where I needed to would have driven a lesser man insane. I knew this and pushed through. Yet, when the opportunity presented itself, I could not do it. An additional set of terrors wormed its way into my mind. A trio of demons aptly called remorse, guilt, and regret. I've tried my best to wrestle control away from these infernal forces, but in the end, as always, I've proven to be too weak. Unable to accomplish the single-minded goal I've devoted my life to, I let him go. In that fateful moment, it felt like I had done the right thing by letting him go. I felt a weight lifted off of my chest. Now, with the clarity of hindsight, I'm no longer sure about that. That said, I'm getting ahead of myself. I suppose I should start from the beginning. My name is Yaroslav Chowter, and I hail from a small Siberian village, far from any center of civilization. Its name is irrelevant. Knowing what I know now, my relatives were partially right, and outsiders have no place in it. The important thing about my home village is that it is a settlement frozen in the early modern era. Growing up, we had no electricity and no other modern luxuries. It was, and still is, as far as I know, a small rural community of old believers. When I say old believers, I mean that my people never adopted Christianity. They, believe in the old gods, Perun, and Veles, Svarog, and Dashbog, along with Mokosh, and many other minor deities and nature spirits. What outsiders consider folklore or fiction, my people to this very day hold to be the truth, and nothing but the truth. My village had no doctors, and there was a common belief that there were no ill people either. The elders always told us how no one had ever died from disease before Soviets made incursions into our lands. Whenever someone died, and it was said to be the result of old age, the horned shepherd had taken them to his grazing fields, they used to say. They said the same thing about my grandparents, who passed away unexpectedly, one after the other, in a span of about a year. Grandma succumbed to grief after losing the love of her life. Whenever people died in accidents or were relatively young, the locals blamed unnatural forces. Yet, no matter the evidence, disease didn't exist until around my childhood. At least not according to the people. At some point, however, everything changed in the blink of an eye. Boris Beard Bogdanov, named so after his long and bushy graying beard, fell ill. He was constantly burning with fever, and over time his frame shrunk. The disease he contracted reduced him from a hulk of a man to a shell no larger than my dying grandfather in his last days. He was wasting away before our very eyes. The village folk attempted to chalk it up to the malevolent spirits, poisoning his body and soul. Soon after him, his entire family got sick too. Before long, half of the village was on the brink of death. My father got ill too. I can vividly recall the moment death came knocking at our door. He was bound to suffer a slow and agonizing journey to the other side. It was a chilly spring night when I awoke, feeling the breeze enter and penetrate our home. That night, the darkness seemed to be bleaker than ever before. It was so dark that I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face. A chill ran down my spine. For the first time in years, I was afraid of the dark again. The void stared at me, and I couldn't help but dread its awful gaze. At 11 years old, I nearly pissed myself again, just by looking around my bedroom and being unable to see anything. I was blind with fear. At that moment, I was blind. The nothingness swallowed my eyes all around me, and I wish it had stayed that way. I wish I had never looked toward my parents' bed. The second I laid my eyes on my sleeping parents, reality took any semblance of innocence away from me. The unbearable weight of realization collapsed onto my infantile little body, dropping me to my knees with a startle. An animal instinct inside ordered my mouth to be open, but no sound came out. With my eyes transfixed on the sinister scene, I remained eerily quiet, gasping for air and holding back frightful tears. Every tall tale, every legend, every child's story I had grown out of by that point came back to haunt my psyche on that one fateful night. All of this turned out to be true. As I sat there on my knees holding on to dear life, a silhouette made of barely visible mist crouched over my sleeping father. Its head pressed against father's neck, teeth sunk firmly into his arteries. The silhouette was eating away at my father. I could see this much, even though it was practically impossible to see anything else. As if the silhouette had some sort of malignant luminance about it. The demon wanted to be seen. I must have made enough noise to divert its attention from its meal, because it turned to me and straightened itself out into this tall, serpentine, and barely visible shadow caricature of a human. Its limbs were so long enough to drag across the floor. Its features were barely distinguishable from the mist surrounding it. The thing was nearly invisible, only enough to inflict the terror it wanted to afflict in its victims. The piercing stare of its blood-red eyes kept me paralyzed in place as a wide smile formed across its face. Crimson-stained, razor-sharp teeth peeked from behind its ashen-gray lips, and a long tongue hung loosely between its jaws. The image of that thing has burnt itself into my mind from the moment we met. The devil placed a bony, clawed finger on its lips, signaling for me to keep silence. Stricken with mortifying fear, I couldn't object, nor resist. With tears streaming down my cheeks, I did all I could. I nodded. The thing vanished into the darkness, crawling away into the night. Exhausted and aching across my entire body, I barely pulled myself upright once it left. Still deep within the embrace of petrifying fear, it took all I had left to crawl back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The image of that bloodied silhouette made from a mist, my father's vitality, clawed my eyes open every time I dared to close them. The next morning, father was already sick, burning with fever. I knew what had caused it, but I wouldn't dare speak up. I knew that if I had sounded the alarm on the man made from mist, the locals would have accused me of being the monster itself. The idea around my village was if you were old enough to work the household farm, you were an adult man. If you were an adult man, you were old enough to protect your family. Me being unable to fight off the evil creature harming my parent meant I was cooperating with it, or was the source of said evil. Shame and regret at my inability to stand up for my father ate away at every waking moment, while the ever-returning presence of the man made from mist robbed me of my sleep every night. He came, night after night, to feast on my father's waning life. He tried to shake me into full awareness every single time he returned, tormenting me with my weakness. Every day I told myself this one would be different, but every time it ended the same. I was on my knees, unable to do anything but gawk in horror at the pest taking away my father and chipping away at my sanity. With a couple of months, my father was gone. When we buried him, I experienced a semblance of solace. Hopefully the man made from mist would never come back again, wishing him to be satisfied with what he had taken away from me. I was too quick to jump to my conclusion. This world is cruel by nature, and as per the laws of the wild, a predator has no mercy on its prey whilst it starves. My tormentor would return to take away from me so long as it felt the need to satiate its hunger. Before long, I woke up once more in the middle of the night. It was cold for summer. Too cold. Dreadful thoughts flooded my mind. Fearing for the worst, I jerked my head to look at my mother. Thankfully, she was alone, sound asleep. But I couldn't ease my mind away from the possibility that he had returned. I hadn't slept that night. In fact, I haven't slept right since. Never. The next morning, I woke up to an ailing mother. She was burning with fever, and I was right to fear for the worst. He was there the previous night, and he was going to take my mother away from me. I stayed up every night since to watch over my mother, mustering every ounce of courage I could to confront the nocturnal beast haunting my life. It never returned. Instead, it left me to watch as my mother withered away to disease like a mad dog. The fever got progressively worse, and she was losing all color. In a matter of days, it took away her ability to move, speak, and eventually reason. I had to watch as my mother slipped away, barking and clawing at the air. She recoiled every time I offered her water and attempted to bite into me whenever I'd got too close. The furious stage lasted about a week before she slipped into a deep slumber, and after 3 more days of sleep, she perished. A skeletal, pale, gaunt husk remained of what was once my mother. While I watched an evil, malevolent force tear my family to shreds, my entire world seemed to be engulfed by its flames. By the time my mother succumbed to her condition, more than half of the villagers were dead. The Soviets incurred into our lands. They wore alien suits as they took away whatever healthy children they could find, myself included. I fought and struggled to stay in the village, but they overpowered me. Proper adults had to restrain me so they could take me away from this hell and into the heart of civilization. After the authorities had placed me in an orphanage, the outside world forcibly enlightened me. It took me years, but eventually, I figured out how to blend with the city folk. They could never fix the so-called trauma of what I had to endure. But there was nothing they could do to mold the broken into a healthy adult. The damage had been too great for my wounds to heal. I adjusted to my new life and was driven by a lifelong goal to avenge whatever had taken my life away from me. I ended up dedicating my life to figuring out how to eradicate the disease that had taken everything from me after overhearing how an ancient strain of Siberian anthrax reanimated and wiped out half of my home village. They excuse the bite marks on people's necks as infected sores. It took me a long time, but I've gotten myself where I needed to be. The Soviets were right to call it a disease, but it wasn't anthrax that had decimated my home village and taken my parents' lives. It was something far worse, an untreatable condition that turns humans into hematophagic corpses somewhere between living and dead. Fortunately, the only means of treatment seemed to be the termination of the remaining processes vital to sustaining life in the afflicted. It's an understanding I came to have after long years of research, under often illegal circumstances. The initial idea came about after a particularly nasty dream about my mother's last days. In the dream, she rose from her bed and fell on all fours. Frothing from her mouth, she coughed and barked simultaneously. Moving awkwardly on all fours, she crawled across the floor toward me. With her hands clawing at my bedsheets, she pulled herself upwards and screeched into my face, letting out a terrible sound between a shrill cry and a cough. Eyes wide with delirious agitation, her face lunged at me, attempting to bite whatever she could. I cowered away under my sheets, trying to weather the rabid storm. Eventually, she clasped her jaws around my arm, and the pain from my dream jolted me awake. Covered in cold sweat and nearly hyperventilating, that's where I had my eureka moment. I was a medical student at the time. This seemed like something that fit neatly into my field of expertise, virology. Straining my mind for more than a couple of moments conjured an image of a rabies-like condition that afflicted those who the man-made from mist attacked. Those who didn't survive, anyway. 9 out of 10 of the afflicted perished. The remaining 1 seemed to slip into a death-like coma before awakening changed. The condition changes the person into something that can hardly be considered living, technically. In a way, those who survive the initial infection are practically, as I've said before, the walking dead. Now, I don't want this to sound occult or supernatural. No, all of this is biologically viable, albeit unusual for the Tetrapoda superclass. If anything, the condition turns the afflicted into a human-shaped leech of sorts. While I might have presented the afflicted to survive the initial stage of the infected as an infallible superhuman predator, they are, in fact, maladapted to cohabitate with their prey in this day and age. That is, us. Ignoring the obvious need to consume blood and to a lesser extent certain amounts of living flesh, the virus inadvertently mimics certain symptoms of a tuberculosis infection, at least outwardly. That is exactly how I've been able to find test subjects for my study. Hearing about death row inmates who matched the profile of advanced tuberculosis patients, but had somehow committed heinous crimes including cannibalism. Through some connections I've made with the local authorities, I got my hands on the corpse of one such death row inmate. He was eerily similar to the man made from mist, only his facial features seemed different. The uncanny resemblance to my tormentor weighed heavily on my mind. Perhaps too heavily. I noticed a minor muscle spasm that I chalked up to a figment of my anxious imagination. This was my first mistake. The second being when I turned my back to the cadaver to pick up a tool to begin my autopsy. This one nearly cost me my life. Before I could even notice, the dead man sprang back to life, his long, lanky, pale arms wrapped tightly around my neck. His skin was cold to the touch, but his strength was incredible. No man with such a frame should have been able to yield such strength. No man appearing this sick should have been able to possess. Thankfully, I must have stood in an awkward position for him to apply his blood-hold choke. Otherwise, I would have been dead. Or perhaps undead by now. As I scrambled with my hands to pick up something from the table to defend myself with, I could hear his hoarse voice in my ear.
I am sorry. I am staggering.
The sudden realization I was dealing with a thing human enough to apologize to me took my complete surprise. With a renewed flow of adrenaline through my system, my once worst enemy, fear, became my best friend. The reduced supply of oxygen to my brain eased my paralyzing dread just enough for me to pick up the scalpel from the table and forcibly jab it into the predator's head. His grip loosened instantly, and with a sickening thump, he fell to the floor behind me, knocking over the table. The increased blood flow brought with it a maddening existential dread. My head spun and my heart raced through the roof. Terrible, illogical, intangible thoughts swarmed my mind. There was fear interlaced with anger, a burning wrath. The animalistic side of me took over, and I began kicking at the dead man's body again and again. I wouldn't stop until I couldn't recognize his face as human. Blood, torn out hair, and teeth flew across the floor before I finally came to. Collapsing to the floor right beside the corpse, I sat there for a long while, shaking with fear, clueless about the source of my fear. After all, it was truly dead this time. I was sure of it. My shoes cracked its skull open and destroyed the brain. There was no way it could have survived without a functioning brain. This was a reasoning thing. It needed its brain. Yet, there I was, afraid. Not shaken. Afraid. This was another event that etched itself into my memories, giving birth to yet another reoccurring nightmare. Time and time again, I would see myself mutilating the corpse, each time to a worse degree. No matter how often I tried to convince myself I did what I did in self-defense, my heart wouldn't care. I was a monster to my own psyche. I deeply regret to admit this, but this was not the only time I had killed, and it too perhaps escaped this world in the quickest way possible. Regardless, I ended up performing the autopsy on that body of the man whose second life I truly ended. As per my findings, I must admit, my understanding of anatomical matters is by all means limited. I could see why the execution failed. The heart was a black and shriveled up atrophied muscle. Shooting one of those things in the chest isn't likely to truly kill them. Not only had the heart become a vestigial organ, but the lungs of the specimen I had autopsied revealed regenerative scar tissue. These things could survive what would otherwise be lethal to average humans. The digestive system, just like the pulmonary one, differed vastly from what I had expected from the human anatomy. It seemed better suited to hold mostly liquid for quick digestion. Circulation, while reduced, still existed, giving the fact the creature possessed almost superhuman strength. To my understanding, the circulation is driven by musculoskeletal mechanisms explaining the pallor. The insufficient nutritional value of their diet can easily explain their gauntness. Unfortunately, this study didn't yield many more useful results for my research. However, I ended up extracting an interesting enzyme from the mouth of the corpse, with great difficulty given the circumstances. These things develop Draculin, a special anticoagulant found in vampire bats. As much as I'd hate to call these unfortunate creatures vampires, this is exactly what they are. Perhaps some legends were true, yet at that moment none of it mattered. I wanted to find out more. I needed to find out more. To make a painfully long story short, I'll conclude my search by saying that for the longest time, I had searched for clues using dubious methods. This, of course, didn't yield the desired results. My only solace during that period was the understanding that these creatures are solitary and, thus, could not warn others about my activities and intentions. With the turn of the new millennium, fortune shone my way. Finally. Shortly before the infamous Armin Maiwes affair, I had experienced something not too dissimilar. I found a post on a message board outlining a request for a willing blood donor for cash. This wasn't what one could expect from a blood donation, however. The poster specified he was interested in drinking the donor's blood and, if possible, straight from the source. This couldn't be any more similar to the type of person I'd been looking for. Disinterested in the money, I offered myself up. That said, I wasn't interested in anyone drinking my blood either, so to facilitate a fair deal, I had to get a few bags of stored blood. With my line of work, that wasn't too hard. A week after contacting the poster of the message, we arranged a meeting. He wanted to meet me at his house. Thinking he might intend to get more aggressive than I needed him to be, I made sure I had my pistol when I met him. Overall, he seemed like an alright person for an anthropophagic hemophile. Other than the instance on keeping the lighting lower than I'd usually like during our meeting, everything was better than I could have ever expected. At first, he seemed taken aback by my offer of stored blood for information. But after the first sip of plasmoid liquid, he relented. To my surprise, he and I were a lot alike, as far as personality traits go. As he explained to me, there wasn't much that still interested him in life anymore. He could no longer form any emotional attachments nor feel the most potent emotions. The one glaring exception was the high he got from feeding. I too cannot feel much beyond bitter disappointment and the ever-present anxious dread that seems to shadow every moment of my being. I have burned every personal bridge I ever had in favor of this ridiculous quest for revenge I wasn't sure I could ever complete. This pleasant and brief encounter confirmed my suspicions. The infected are solitary creatures and prefer to stay away from all other intelligent life forms when not feeding. I've also learned that to stay functional on the abysmal diet of blood and the occasional lump of flesh, the infected enter a state of hibernation that can last for years at a time. He confirmed my suspicion that the infected dislike bright lights and preferred to hunt and overall go about their rather monotone lives at night. The most important piece of information I had received from this fine man was the fact that the infected rarely venture far from when they first succumbed to the plague. So long, of course, as they could find enough prey. Otherwise, like all other animals, they migrate and stick to their new location. Interestingly enough, I could almost see the sorrow in his crimson eyes, a deep regret and a desire to escape an unseen pain that kept gnawing at him. I asked him about it, wondering if he was happy with where his life had taken him. He answered negatively. I wish he had asked the same question, so I could just tell someone how miserable I had made my life. He never did, but I'm sure he saw his reflection in me. He was certainly bright enough to tell as much. in a rare moment of empathy, I offered to end his life. He smiled a genuine smile and confessed that he tried many times over without ever succeeding. He explained that his displeasure wasn't the result of depression, but rather that he was tired of his endless boredom. Back then, I couldn't even tell the difference. Smiling back at him, I told him the secret to his survival was his brain staying intact. He quipped about it, making all the sense in the world, and told me he had no firearms. I pulled out my pistol, aiming at his head, and joked about how he wouldn't need one. He laughed, and when he did, I pulled the trigger. The laughter stopped, and the room fell silent. Too silent. And with it, he fell as well, dead for good this time. Even though this act of killing was justified, it still frequented my dreams. Yet another nightmare to a gallery of never-ending visual sorrows. This one, however, was more melancholic than terrifying, but just as nerve-wracking. He lost all reason to live. To exist just to feed, this was below things. No, people like us. The longer I did this, all of this, the more I realized I was dealing with my fellow humans. Unfortunately, the humans I've been dealing with have drifted away from the light of humanity. The cruelty of nature had them reduced to wild animals, controlled by a base instinct without having the proper way of employing their higher reasoning for something greater. These were victims of a terrible curse, as was I. My obsession with vengeance only grew worse. I had to bring the nightmare I had reduced my entire life to an end. Armed with the knowledge of how to find my tormentor, I finally headed back to my home village. A few weeks later, I arrived near the place of my birth, near where I had spent the first 11 years of my life. It was night, the perfect time to strike. That was easier said than done. Just overlooking the village from a distance proved difficult. With each passing second, a new suppressed memory resurfaced. A new night terror to experience whilst awake. The same diabolical presence marred all of them. Countless images flashed before my eyes, all of them painful. Some were more horrifying than others. My father's slow demise, my mother's agonizing death, all of it tainted by the sickening shadow standing at the corner of the bedroom. Tall, pale, barely visible, as if he was a part of the nocturnal fog itself. Only red eyes shining, glowing in the darkness, along with the red hue dripping from his sickening smile. Bitter, angry, hurting, and afraid, I lost myself in my thoughts. My body knew where to find him. However, we were bound by a red thread of fate. Somehow, from that first day, when he made me his plaything, he ended up tying our destinies together. I could probably smell the stench of iron surrounding him. I was fuming, ready to incinerate his body into ash and scatter it into the nearest river. Worst of all was the knowledge I shouldn't look for anyone in the village, lest I infect them with some disease they'd never encountered before. It could potentially kill them all. I wouldn't be any better than him if I let such a thing happen. My inability to reunite with any surviving neighbors and relatives hurt so much that I can't even put it into words. All of that seemed to fade away once I found his motionless cadaver, resting soundly in a den by the cemetery. How cliché. The undead dwelling in burial grounds. In that moment, bereft of his serpentine charm, everything seemed so different from what I had remembered. He wasn't that tall. He wasn't much bigger than I was when he took everything from me. I almost felt dizzy. realizing he wasn't even an adult properly. My memories had tricked me. Everything seemed so bizarre and unreal at that moment. I was once again a lost child, once again confronted by a monster that existed only in my imagination. I trained my pistol on his death-like form. Yet in that moment when our roles were reversed, when he suddenly became a helpless child, I was the man made from mist. When I had all the power in the world and he lay at my feet, unable to do anything to protect himself from my cruelty, I couldn't do it. I couldn't shoot him. I couldn't do it because I knew it wouldn't help me. It wouldn't bring my family back. Killing him wouldn't fix me, nor restore the family I gave up on. It wouldn't even make me feel any better. There was no point at all. I wouldn't feel any better if I put that bullet in him. Watching that pathetic carcass, I realized how little all of that mattered. My nightmares wouldn't end, and the anxiety and hatred would not go away. There was nothing that could ever heal my wounds. I will suffer from them so long as I am human. As much as I hate to admit it, I pitied him in that very moment. As I've said, letting him go was a mistake. Maybe if I went through with my plan, I wouldn't end up where I am now. Instead of taking his life, I took some of his flesh. I cut off a little piece of his calf. He didn't even budge when my knife sliced through the pale leg like butter. This was the Pyrrhic victory I had to have over him. A foolish and animalistic display of dominance over the person whose shadow dominated my entire life. That wasn't the only reason I did what I did. I took a part of him just in case I could no longer bear the weight of my 3 demons. Knowing people like him do not feel the most intense emotions, I was hoping for a quick and permanent solution, should the need arise. Things did eventually spiral out of control. My sanity was waning, and with it the will to keep on living. But instead of shooting myself, I ate a piece of him that I kept stored in my fridge. I did so with the expectation of the disease killing my overstressed immune system and eventually me. Sadly, there are very few permanent solutions in this world and fewer quick ones that yield the desired outcomes. I did not die, technically. Instead, the man made from mist was reborn. At first, everything seemed so much better. Sharper, clearer, and by far more exciting. But for how long will such a state remain exciting when it's the default state of being? After a while, everything started losing its color to the point of everlasting bleakness. Even my memories aren't as vivid as they used to be, and the nightmares no longer have any impact. They're merely pictures moving in a sea of thought. With that said, life isn't much better now than it was before. I don't hurt. I don't feel almost at all. The only time I ever feel anything is whenever I sink my teeth into the neck of some unsuspecting drunk. My days are mostly monochrome grey with the occasional streak of red, but that's not nearly enough. Unfortunately, I lost my pistol at some point, so I don't have any way out of this tunnel of mist. It's not all bad. I just wish my nightmares would sting a little again. Otherwise, what is the point of dwelling on every mistake you've ever committed? What is the point of tragedy if it cannot bring you to the catharsis of sorrow? What is the point in reliving every blood-soaked nightmare that has ever plagued your mind if they never bring any feelings of pain or joy? Is there even a point behind a recollection that carries no weight? There is none. Everything I've ever wanted is within reach, yet whenever I extend my hand to grasp at something, anything, it all seems to drift away from me. And now, only now, once the boredom that shadows my every move has finally exhausted me, now that I am completely absorbed by this unrelenting, impenetrable, and bottomless sensation of emptiness, this longing for something, anything, I can say I truly understand what horror is. I can say, without a shadow of doubt, that the man made from mist isn't me, nor any other person or even a creature. No, the man made from mist is the embodiment of pure horror, of fear, one so bizarre and malignant, it exists only to torment those afflicted with sentience.
Love horror stories? Well, I've got plenty to share. I'm Otis Gyrie, your host, for Otis Gyrie's Nightmare Fuel, where every week I spin spine-chilling tales that'll have you sleeping with the lights on. Picture this: a crackling campfire, the dark woods of Camp Duskwood, and twilight like whispering in the distance. That's where I invite campers, just like you, to join me around the fire as I share stories of haunted highways, cursed deals, and things lurking just out of sight. If you're a fan of chilling tales for dark nights, you'll feel right at home by my fire. So pull up a seat. The stories are dark, fire's warm, and there's always room for one more camper. Just don't wander too far into the woods. You never know what's watching. Otis Gyrie's Nightmare Fuel has just debuted, and I've got spine-tingling episodes waiting for you to binge right now. New campers, join me every Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time for fresh tales of terror. Available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you find quality podcasts. Join the campfire, if you dare.
That was Man Made from Mist, as written by M. Lycantrope and performed masterfully by our guest, Skott Pye.
Cheers, Geoff. This story really resonated with me. The way it balances horror with raw humanity, and that bittersweet ending really packs a punch.
It's stories like this that remind us why horror is such a powerful genre. And stay tuned, because Skott has another horrifying tale lined up for you. Our next story, written by Ganimes, takes us deep into the heart of Stag Creek Forest, where two officers investigate a string of mysterious disappearances. Without further delay, here's Skott Pye with another entry from his archives at his NaturesTemper YouTube channel. I give you The Minotaur of Stag Creek.
The banshee shriek and strobing lights of the cruiser died down as Officer Hank Lewis switched off the ignition. The journey was far from pleasant. The damn vehicle had almost surrendered to the stubborn, gluttonous mud that led up the road. With a grunt filled with both frustration and relief, Lewis swung the door open and hauled himself out of the car, slamming the door with a hollow thud. Officer J. Bradshaw climbed from the other side. He was a wiry fellow, a Brit, with a look of apprehension on his face, Luz didn't blame him. In truth, he didn't exactly want to be there either. Luz wiped a sheen of sweat from his brow. He reached for his radio, which ran on one of those new armor systems, and flicked on the receiver. "Dispatch, this is MB32A 1097. We're at the scene."
"Copy that, MB32. Anything of note?"
As he gazed up at the old wooden fence, covered in graffiti and lichen, Luz shook his head. "Nothing." The radio went silent as he stepped forward. A sign affixed to the fence, faded with age, read, "Welcome to Stag Creek Woods." Beyond the fence, the woods started, a mass of green and brown and black, a wilderness of trees and shrubbery. He took a deep breath. To his right, Bradshaw stood silently, waiting. Luz looked at him, and with a nod turned on his flashlight. He pushed open the old gate, rotten, damp and unpleasant to the touch, and held it open. Once the two of them were through, Luz let it swing shut behind him. Luz felt uncomfortable somehow. A feeling of unease crept through him, part nyctophobia, part claustrophobia. He was used to the well-lit streets, not a pitch-black woodland. By all accounts, neither of them should have been there in the first place. Unfortunately for Luz, the rural division had been short-staffed, and naturally, he and Bradshaw had been lumbered with the job. Now they were paying the price. At least there were other officers in the area. While Luz and Bradshaw were operating primarily in the west, 3 other groups were stationed in different corners of the woods. Canine units were operating elsewhere, but neither of them had the luxury of a dog. The outer parts of the woodland, like the fence that surrounded it, were littered with missing posters. Luz shone his light over them, despite already knowing the details. He didn't know why. Maybe it was some way of trying to distract himself from his surroundings. The photograph was rather low in quality. Then again, the whole thing was. It depicted a relatively young woman, brunette and heavyset, identified as Gina Montgomery by the bold typeface at the bottom. There was a Winchester rifle slung over her shoulder. A hunter, Luz observed. "Come on," Bradshaw said. "We've got time to stare at the bloody posters, let's go." They continued on their path, Bradshaw up ahead. As the two of them took their first steps into the woodland, the missing posters grew sparser, until one remained and the trees were bare. Stag Creek Forest was an eerie place at night. Occasionally, a shadowy shape would appear against the beam of the flashlight. Every single time, Luz realized that it was nothing but a raccoon or a skunk, or something of that nature. He had a near miss with a skunk after about a half an hour, and narrowly avoided a snake right after that. There was wildlife everywhere, and that posed quite a problem. If the two of them found a body, and Luz strongly hoped they wouldn't find a body, chances were that scavengers would get to it before they did. No use worrying about it, though. Not yet. Luz decided to just keep going and hope for the best. Luz shone his beam straight down and spotted something on the ground. There were indentations in the leaf litter, regular and far too big to have been made by raccoons. "Hey," he said. "Take a look at this." Bradshaw turned around and looked at the tracks. He bent down and examined them properly. "Footprints," he said, stating the obvious. "How fresh do you think they are?" "I'd say," he thought about it, "a couple of days. Time frame adds up. Let's keep moving." He followed Bradshaw as he moved further into the woods. There was a strong sense of déjà vu about it. They hadn't been here before, obviously, or at least Luz himself hadn't. But there was a dim familiarity to it. Of course there was. Luz had grown up around forest, but that didn't mean being in unfamiliar woodland during the night was any easier. He still felt very vulnerable. This place gives me the creeps already, muttered Lewis. Silence. There was no response from Bradshaw. All Lewis heard now were the chirps of crickets. Jay? Nothing. Jay Bradshaw had spotted something on a tree. As he passed by, he thought little of it. Only when he'd passed it did he stop to think. His curiosity had gotten the better of him, and he'd gone back to check it out. Looking at the tree, a big Sitka spruce, Bradshaw scrutinized its bark. There were deep gashes in the wood, deep enough to tear through the cambium layer. Chunky sap oozed from it like blood from a wound. At the tree's base lay branches that looked to have been snapped off by some powerful force. The first thought Bradshaw had was that it was a bear. He could only make out 3 claw marks, and each seemed to be oriented in the wrong direction. That was no bear. He turned and opened his mouth to say something to Lewis, but there was no sign of him. Furrowing his brow, Bradshaw yelled, "Lewis!" There was no answer. He tried again, but again got no reply, and heard only crickets. Fumbling around in his belt, Bradshaw withdrew his radio. He tried Lewis' channel, but received only static. Switching channels, he spoke. "Dispatch, this is MB32B. I got separated from MB32A. I'm near a big Sitka spruce. Rough location is Stag Creek Forest. Over." There was silence from the other end. Over the din of the radio, Lewis could make out the sound of rustling leaves and snapping branches. A moment later, the voice of the dispatcher broke the silence.
MB32B, have you attempted to contact MB32A?
Twice so far, no response. Over.
Copy that. Keep us updated and keep trying to reestablish contact.
Understood. Bradshaw slotted the radio back into its holster. Damn it, Hank, where are you? He turned away from the mangled tree trunk and continued. About 5 minutes after leaving the Sitka spruce, something appeared in Bradshaw's periphery. He spun around. Lewis? There was no reply. Whatever it was carried on unperturbed. Some sort of animal, maybe. He raised his flashlight and shone it on the vegetation nearby. It moved. Bradshaw furrowed his brow and walked a little closer, but not too far. A sharp screech came from the bush barely 3 feet from his ear. He swung the flashlight and chuckled. It was a raccoon. Son of a bitch. He watched the bewildered animal as it disappeared into the night. Lewis had decided to press on, following the tracks. Bradshaw would catch up eventually, he was sure of it. After a while, he decided to sit down on an old mossy log, and there he waited. But there was no sign. Eventually, he got up. If he couldn't find Bradshaw, and if Bradshaw wasn't going to come to him, he tried to track down one of the other officers. A burst of static interrupted his thoughts, and he could barely make out what was being said.
Radio check. MB32A, do you copy?
He fumbled in his belt and pulled out his radio. Reading you loud and clear, dispatch. Over.
Any contact with the MB32B? He's looking for you.
Haven't heard a bloody thing. Over. A pause.
Do you know your location? Is there anyone else in the vicinity?
Lewis got to his feet and shone his flashlight around. I haven't the faintest clue. As far as I know, I'm the only officer in the sector. Over.
Copy that.
The radio clicked. Lewis glanced behind him, shining his flashlight into the darkness, and again saw nothing. He set off, continuing to follow the footprints. He wanted to back out, but alone or otherwise, he still had a job to do. For a while, Hank Lewis walked on, until the sound of rushing water reached his ears. Shining his flashlight up ahead, he saw the ground abruptly drop off. Must be Stag Creek, Lewis thought to himself as he walked closer. His approach confirmed his suspicions. Stag Creek was relatively wide, a tributary of the Eel River. The banks were surrounded by rocks and the water level was low. Most of the riverbed was filled with sludge and silt. Beneath the surface were countless boulders and submerged logs, and it stank to high heaven. Rotten eggs. That was the closest approximation Luz could find. The smell was that of rotten eggs. He narrowed his eyes. What the hell? What could be causing that in the middle of the woods? Sewage? But as Luz stood there, the scent seemed to fade. The rattle of gunfire rang out from somewhere in the woods. Luz's head turned. He saw a bright flashlight through the distant trees. As he took a step towards the source of the noise, they were replaced by something else. The wind now carried with it the sound of screaming. And the yelping of dogs. His gun held in a white-knuckled grip, Luz walked slowly backwards towards the creek. He was only dimly aware of his footing as he slipped in the mud. All thoughts dissipated and he felt the tug of gravity winning over. He felt a sharp pain in his left calf as he fell. He landed face down at the bottom of the embankment. Screwing his eyes shut, he pushed himself clear of the sludge. He coughed hard and fumbled for his pistol, reassured by the sensation of the grip on his handle. Luz climbed to his feet slowly, shakily. Opening his eyes, at last, he looked down at himself. There was a big tear in his calf, a gash, blood. Luz gritted his teeth. "Fucking hell," he said to nobody in particular. It wasn't too bad, a flesh wound at best. But the risk of infection was there. Suddenly he felt vulnerable. The scent of blood would carry. Reaching into his duty belt, he withdrew a tourniquet and started to apply it. It was a slapdash job, but it would do the trick. Once that was done, he reached for his radio. A sinking feeling crept over Luz when he felt it. It was very clearly broken. Ah, crap. Feeling his leg wound gingerly, Luz grimaced. A thought crossed his mind. The squad car. There were probably still some band-aids in there. If he could just get back to it, he'd be in the clear. Luz began walking, but paused after only a moment. His gaze landed on something on the other side of the creek. Furrowing his brow, he walked closer. The footprints started up again on the opposite bank, but this time they were irregular. The track maker had fallen, and Luz noted they hadn't been lucky. Probably twisted an ankle or something, but as he started following the tracks, Luz's eyes landed on something else. More tracks, a totally different shape. Hoofprints. They looked like those of a moose, but they couldn't have been. There were no moose in California, let alone Humboldt County. Without breaking stride, Luz began to follow the tracks. The thought of calling for help passed through Bradshaw's head, but he decided against it. It wasn't out of pride or anything, more so the opposite, a refusal to admit to anyone that he was lost. Sighing, Bradshaw continued to walk, and that was when the sounds hit him. His first thought was it sounded like gunfire. His second was that it was gunfire. Turning his head in the direction, Bradshaw looked through the trees, and he saw flashlights in the distance. Something moved through the vegetation directly behind him. Bradshaw spun around to face its source. At first he was hopeful. Was it Luz? "Hello?" he said loudly. "Hank?" No reply. He shone his flashlight in that direction, but he saw nothing. No movement, no Luz. The sound was coming from beyond the reach of Bradshaw's flashlight. Then the smell struck him. A horrid odor like rotten eggs. A bead of sweat trickled down Bradshaw's forehead, and he tightened his grip on the object in his hand. God, he thought to himself, get a grip. There were probably hundreds of rational explanations for that smell. It wasn't like he could think of any, but there must have been. Taking a deep breath, Bradshaw walked towards the source of the smell. It was awful, and now he could discern the undertone of it. What the fuck? As the sulfur smell faded, the rotting smell seemed to grow stronger as a low drone filled the air. He covered his face with his sleeve and shone his flashlight on the ground. The scene before him closely resembled a kill site. Scraps of tattered fabric were strewn across like confetti. The buzz of flies drowned out every single sound. Bradshaw's eyes landed on the mass sprawled in the middle. Christ alive. His mind went blank for a second, feeling bile rise in his throat, and after forcing it back down, he fumbled for his radio. Dispatch, this is MB32B. I have a 10-100. I repeat, I have a 10-100. The exact location is unclear, though surrounded by oak trees. Bradshaw's radio crackled.
Copy that, MB32B.
Came the voice of the dispatcher. As it faded into silence yet again, leaving only the buzzing of flies, Bradshaw felt sick. God, he regretted being here, but he didn't have time to calm down. A sound came from behind him. Whirling around, he reached for the holster on his waist and pulled out the pistol. Another noise punctuated the monotone droning. Footfalls. Right behind him. He didn't have enough time to fire. The trees around Luz grew sparser as he trudged further from the woodland's dark depths. The air seemed to grow heavy, and it was almost unnervingly silent. A few times Luz thought he'd heard something moving through the vegetation nearby. Hell, he probably had. But then, everything sounded louder in the woods. Worse still, it had started to rain, and now he was utterly drenched. But despite the downpour, that sulphur stench had returned in force, and it was as if Luz had headed straight towards its point of origin. It hadn't been there when Bradshaw passed through earlier that night. He was sure of it. His thoughts were interrupted by a hideous scream, followed by 2 loud gunshots. Instinctively, Luz whipped out his handgun and spun around in the direction of its source, his heart pounding hard in his chest. The scream was unmistakably human. "Bradshaw?" he half yelled. He was met with silence. The screaming stopped abruptly. Reholstering his pistol, Luz raised his flashlight in that direction. Nothing. He staggered in the direction of the scream. Something must have happened. Had Bradshaw fallen? Luz pushed through the dense underbrush, his footsteps muffled by the leaf litter. Cursing his lack of functioning radio, he pressed forward. A faint rustling sound reached his ears, and he knew that it couldn't have been Bradshaw. It was too close. He directed his flashlight in the direction of the noise. A flash of movement, so quick that for a moment he questioned whether he had seen it. Was that an animal? A person? "Who's there?" he barked, with renewed, if deceptive, bravado. There was no answer. "Don't try anything stupid, I'm armed." Again, no answer. The stench of rotten eggs reached his nostrils again. It was almost unbearable now, as if some hellish smoke was billowing into his lungs. Luz coughed hard and staggered back. From just beyond the reach of his light, he could faintly discern a noise. It was the sound of loud inhalations and exhalations. Luz pulled out his sidearm and aimed it shakily into the inky blackness. Unsteadily, he stepped closer, staring into the void. He was dimly aware that the void was staring back. "Come on, you little shit," he mouthed. "Come out here where I can see you." But he heard nothing, saw no more. The smell faded away. It was gone. Luz lowered his gun and squinted into the night. From his left came a noise. He held his breath and listened. It was breathing. Bradshaw's breathing. Stuffing the gun back in its holster, Luz staggered in the direction of the noise. "Bradshaw!" he yelled again. This time there was a response. A weak scoff. Bad time. Luz quickened his pace, his heart pounding in his chest. With each step, the ground beneath his feet grew increasingly uneven, making his progress even more difficult. He stumbled over the protruding roots and fallen branches, his injured calf searing with pain. His flashlight finally landed on Jay Bradshaw's form on the ground. The first thing Luz saw was blood. God, there was so much blood. Bradshaw managed to apply a tourniquet to his leg. Jesus, Luz muttered. Stay still, Jay. What happened here? Bradshaw shook his head. Your guess is as good as mine. He seemed lucid, which was a good sign. One moment everything was fine, and then I don't even know. Was it a bear? A scoff. Bradshaw gestured to Lou's left. Would a bear do that? Luz turned around. There was the body of a woman, slumped against the base of a tree, her glazed hazel eyes staring vacantly into the sky. Skin torn, showing early signs of decay. The abdominal cavity was torn wide open, almost hollowed out. Tattered pieces of clothing seemed oddly jagged, like they'd been bitten into. Nearby, a Winchester rifle lay, snapped clean in two. Her throat had been crushed. Oh shit, that's Montgomery. Jesus, Luz breathed. I had a good look at it, Bradshaw said. Saw it feeding. And let me tell you, that thing wasn't like any bear I've ever seen. Do you still have your radio? Bradshaw gestured to his right. Luz snatched up the radio and flicked on the receiver. Dispatch, this is MB32A, Luz said. We have a 10999 and 1054. I repeat, we have a 10999 and a 1054. Requesting immediate backup. Over. A blast of static came from the speakers.
Copy that, MB32A,
said the dispatching officer.
Establishing connection with the radio as we speak. How are you holding up?
Pretty banged up. MB32B is priority for the moment. Over.
Copy that. Can you walk?
Not sure yet.
If you can, try and get back to the squad car and wait. If you can't, try and stay where you are. We'll pick you up.
Bradshaw shrugged. Haven't tried yet. I was more focused on keeping that bastard away. Luz assessed Bradshaw's injuries properly. God, it was worse than he thought. There were cuts, deep cuts. Most were on Bradshaw's arms, though some, thankfully the least severe of the lot, were on his torso. Through tattered clothing, Luz saw the culprit had managed to slash through a knife-proof vest. Christ. Finally, he stood upright and spoke. I think our best bet would be to get going. If that thing comes back, it will. Luz nodded. It took some effort to get Bradshaw back to his feet. The leg with the tourniquet was bad, and the matter was complicated by Lou's wound. But it worked out in the end, and thank fuck for that. With Bradshaw's arm slung around Lou's shoulder for support, the two of them awkwardly made their way through the dense, dark woods. Each step was a struggle in and of itself. With his flashlight clutched tightly in his free hand, Lou scanned the tree line. He was fairly certain they were heading in the right direction. At least, he hoped they were. The stench had faded away. Now there were only the smells of the woods and the blood. From the trees behind them, there came a roar. No, roar was the wrong word. A scream. It was one of those sounds, like a mountain lion in heat or a dying rabbit, that sounded almost human. The sound had a nasal quality, like a bull. What the hell was that? Luz muttered. Bradshaw reached to his sidearm. Hopefully it wasn't what I think it is. As the other officer raised his gun, Luz kept his sight forward. He didn't want to look back, to see the thing that was doubtlessly pursuing them now. A sound came from behind. Footsteps. Loud footsteps, and the smell came back. He stumbled, and his ears rang as Bradshaw fired his first shot. But the sound kept advancing. Luz spun around, aiming at the threat, even though he couldn't see it. Something slammed hard into the two of them. Luz crashed to the ground. A scream filled his ears. He staggered to his feet and spun around. He was dimly aware of something huge grabbing Jay Bradshaw by the throat and hauling him into the air. And Luz fucking ran. He didn't dare to look back. Didn't dare to slow down. He couldn't even afford to trip, or else that would be it. His mind was a whirl of fear, regret, and confusion. The flashlight beam bobbed erratically in front of him, barely illuminating the trees up ahead, but Luz saw far enough. Up ahead was a partly collapsed tree. It was his best bet. Reaching the fallen tree, Luz squeezed himself into the narrow crevice between the trunk and the jumble of branches. He huddled there, breathless and trembling, praying that it wouldn't find him. It passed by. Minutes ticked by agonizingly slow as Luz strained his ears, listening for any sign of the thing. The woods seemed eerily silent, devoid of any sound except for the rustling leaves and his heartbeat. It didn't come back. Taking in a deep breath, Luz slowly emerged from his cover. Hank Luz buried his head in his hands and slumped against the log. Oh God. He'd been stupid. He should have kept shooting, should have risked it and gone after it when it took Bradshaw. But he didn't. And now that thing had claimed its second victim. Luz knew he might be next. He had to get out. He'd get to his squad car and inform dispatch. Taking in a deep breath, he stood upright and started to walk the way he'd come. After what felt like hours of walking, it occurred to Luz that he was lost, and badly at that. Everything looked the same in that bloody woodland, and he was fairly certain that he'd already completely overshot the point he was supposed to turn. But at least the homogeny was starting to fade away. Now Luz could make out gaps in the trees again. Moonlight dimly filtered through the canopy once more. He'd reached a break in the woods. Taking in a deep breath, letting out an unjustified sigh of relief, he pushed on, advancing towards the opening as fast as his aching lungs would allow. He staggered to the edge. Below lay Stag Creek. Its waters swollen by the rain, it had become a frenzied torrent. The sight wiped exhaustion from Luz's mind, replacing it with a sinking feeling of despair. There was no way he could cross it on foot, especially in his weakened state. Luz scanned the area, searching for an alternative route. His eyes landed on a fallen pine tree wedged in the side of the embankment. It was the only way he could get across, precarious as it was. If nothing else, he'd been on the different side of the river to that thing. Cautiously, he made his way around to the rocks that fringed the creek and approached the fallen pine tree. It was long and sturdy, with its branches stripped away by time and weather. Luz could see that it leaned slightly towards the other side of the creek, offering a precarious bridge over the raging waters. Taking deep breath, Luz steadied himself and carefully stepped onto the fallen tree. It wobbled under his weight, making his heart race even faster. He knew that any misstep could send him tumbling into the merciless current below. He kept his focus on the opposite bank, his eyes fixed on a solid patch of ground where he aimed to reach. As he inched forward, the tree groaned and shifted. Each step became a test of balance and nerve. Both dissipated as a scream echoed from the trees. Luz slipped. No, 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 no! He hit the water hard. His left hand was pinned under his body, and he felt a bone snap as he struck the underlying rock. White-hot pain surged through his shoulder. The moment his head cleared the water, he took in a deep breath, and it took every fiber of his being not to scream. His flashlight drifted away from him. With his good arm, Luz strained and barely grabbed it. It still worked, thank fuck. Awkwardly, he struggled to the surface, hooking his arm around a rock and holding himself in place. From somewhere behind him, there came a loud crash. Gritting his teeth from the pain, he spun around. And there it was, rising from the water. It was tall, far taller than a man. The flashlight illuminated a long face atop a thickly muscled neck. Lou's first thought was that it resembled a cow's head, but it was all wrong. Its mouth stretched too far back. The eyes that stared back at Lou's weren't those of a bull, though they faced forward like those of a man. It was, he realized, like a Minotaur. And then, lifting a large 2 foot from the torrent, it started to advance. Lou staggered back, his eyes locked on the creature, watering as that horrid rotten egg stench hit him like a sack of bricks. It was in no rush to attack. It knew he was injured, and it had no reason to charge. Swapping the flashlight for the pistol, Luz raised it and aimed it at the thing. It was the hand he was worst with, but that didn't matter. His finger coiled around the trigger, but the thing kept coming. The moment Hank Luz pulled the trigger, the night briefly turned to day. A bullet struck the Minotaur's thick neck, causing a spray of dark liquid to spurt from the wound. It staggered, clutching the wound with a cleft hand. A low rasp escaped its jaws as it backed off. Luz leveled his pistol at it again and fired. It stumbled back, but then, with a sudden burst of energy, it lunged forward, its heavily muscled body barreling through the water towards him. Oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit! Lou's heart pounded in his chest as he fired off another round. The Minotaur roared in agony, but its momentum was unstoppable. It was too close, and Luz was too slow. A 3-clawed hand swiped at him, catching him across the chest. He collapsed into the water again, racked by pain. The gun was no longer in his grip. On his feet now, Luz saw the thing surging towards him again, and on instinct, he pulled out his flashlight, shining the beam right into its eyes. It staggered to a halt, its 2 long jaws parting in a hideous growl of pain. While it was distracted, Luz fumbled around in the creek for his gun. His fingers brushed against the cold metal of his pistol, and with a surge of relief he grasped onto it. Again he leveled the gun and fired. The Minotaur stopped. Its body shuddered. Blood spurted from the middle of its head. Slowly it pitched forward, crashing into the creek and disappearing beneath the tumultuous surface. Luz watched it for a while, seeing if it would rise, but it never did. Hank Luz lowered his gun, eyes wide, watching it as it sank beneath the surface of the creek. He slumped down on a rock and placed his hand on his chest. It stung, and badly. Luz pulled away his hand and saw blood. Wiping it off with his pant leg, he reached to his belt, pulled out his radio. Oh, thank fuck it still worked. And turned it on, all with his right arm. Dispatch.
MB-32A, what the hell happened?
Shut up, Luz said, gritting his teeth. And listen. MB-32B is MIA. No, KIA. I've tried every radio channel and heard nothing. I need medical assistance, and I need it as soon as possible. Got it? There was a pause from the other end.
Copy that.
And dispatch? No response. I quit.
That was The Minotaur of Stag Creek, as written by Ganimes and narrated by Skott Pye of the NaturesTemper YouTube channel. Scott, it's been an absolute pleasure having you join us tonight. Fan favorite. I think it's safe to say our listeners will be heading over to your channel after this, especially to hear you take on Chilling Tales creator Craig Groshek's The Erasure. When does that one drop, Scott?
Thanks for asking. Tomorrow, actually. Thursday, the 12th of December. And I do hope everyone stops by to take a listen. It's a story that really deserves to be heard. And to everyone tuning in, don't forget to leave a comment mentioning Geoff and the team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. Your support means a lot to all of us.
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up, remind our listeners where they can find you online.
Of course. You can find my narrations on my YouTube channel, NaturesTemper. I'm also on Instagram, X, formerly Twitter, Patreon, Reddit, and Blue Sky. Wherever you choose to connect, I'd love to hear from you. Especially if you're a fan of horror or just enjoy creepy tales.
You heard him. Let's show some support and let him know we sent you. Scott's unique blend of voices and accents brings his narrations to life. Whether it's man-made slashers or unimaginable monstrosities, you won't want to miss out on his content.
Thank you, Geoff.
It's my pleasure. I'm Geoff Sturtevant, and it's been an honor to guide you through tonight's terrifying tales. Don't forget, we'll be welcoming a new guest narrator each Wednesday. So stay tuned for next week's surprise guest, where they and we will once again turn off the lights and turn on the dark. Until next time.
Sweet dreams, listener. Sweet dreams.
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.